All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the second installment of the Compacts in Action webinar series hosted by the Council of State Governments National Center for Interstate Compacts. My name is Andrew Bates, and I'll be your host this afternoon. And on behalf of CSG and our panelists, I'm very glad you're joining us today to learn more about the Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact and the EMS Compact directly from the administrators of these two vital interstate agreements. Occupational licensure interstate compacts, such as CSG and the EMS Compact, are the most powerful tools available to states to facilitate interstate practice of licensed professions without sacrificing public protection. In fact, licensure compacts actually strengthen public protection by allowing for rapid exchange of licensure and disciplinary information through an interstate data system shared by compact member states. But I will leave that to our speakers, who have prepared some great material for us today on the structure, function, and current status of their respective compacts. Before I introduce our first speaker, there are a couple of housekeeping notes that I would like to go over. So audience members are welcome to turn their cameras on or off as they're comfortable, but we ask everyone kindly to please keep themselves muted at all times unless speaking. This webinar is scheduled for 1 hour. And we'll have ample time at the end for question and answer with both of our panelists. So if you have any questions, please hold them until the end or drop them in the chat so we can cover those later on. And finally, this webinar is being recorded for distribution later on. So by remaining on the call, you are giving your implied consent to the recording. So now to introduce our first speaker. Janet Pippen Orwig, in her position with the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, serves as the Associate Executive Director for Member Services and the Executive Director of PSYPACT. She is responsible for monitoring state regulatory and legislative actions and overseeing member services for ASPPB, including mobility initiatives and the Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact, or PSYPACT. Her 25-year career in association management includes experience in customer service, communications, public relations, advocacy, strategic planning, leadership development, and project and program management. Janet earned her paralegal certificate and bachelor's in business administration from Huntingdon College and her MBA from the University of Phoenix. She is a certified association executive. Janet, thanks so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with everyone about the Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact, or PSYPACT as we like to call it. So I'd like to kind of take you on a little bit of a road trip. Next slide, please. So you can't start a road trip without having a starting point. So I think we're going to talk a little bit about the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, which is the association made up of all the licensing boards for psychology across the United States and Canada. They have 65 member jurisdictions, and they are charged with helping all of the licensing boards deal with licensing applicants, registration, providing model acts and model regs to help the licensing boards going forward. Next slide, please. And ASPPB has a long history of dealing with mobility. It started back when it was first created, when they created the exam for professional practice in psychology to try to set an exam that all of the jurisdictions could use to help psychologists transfer from one state to another. They then did the agreement of reciprocity, which allowed states to match their licensing laws. And any state that had a licensing law that matched that joined the agreement, they would accept each other's licensees across state borders. We have a credentials bank, which allows psychologists to bank all of their credentials. They are gathered and primary source verified to be used later on for getting licensed in another jurisdiction. And then we have our certificate for professional qualification in psychology, which was created in 1998. And the psychologist meets the criteria by having the acceptable standards. And then jurisdictions that accept the certificate for speeding up or expediting licensure agree that the certificate meets education, examination, and experience requirements. So psychologists don't have to redocument all that information as they apply for licensure from state to state. And then the Psychology Licensure Universal System serves where ASPPB gathers licensing materials for certain states that participate in that. We gather them, primary source verify them, work with the applicants, and then send a completed packet to the licensing board to review and decide if that person meets their licensing requirements. Next slide, please. So when we started working on CSPACT, we actually had our member boards. ASPPB had all of its licensing boards approaching them and saying, we are running into issues regulating telepsychology. We know it's happening across our state borders, and there's no way that we're able to tell who's coming into our states and how to regulate them. So ASPPB created in 2011 a task force that was tasked with coming up with a way to regulate telepsychology. So of course, because we had the other certificates and other programs, they started working on the e-passport certificate, and it would allow the psychologist to use this certificate to go across states. And it was released for public comment in April of 2013. And the problem that we ran into in trying to get the certificate to function the same way that the CPQ certificate did was that we couldn't figure out how you would discipline across the state lines with strictly just a certificate. So that's kind of where the compact came in. It allowed us the flexibility to meet the needs that we needed and to set the criteria, but it also gave us some teeth and a way to be able to provide discipline as you were crossing across the state lines. The language itself was approved by the ASPPB Board of Directors in February of 2015, which was a little late to get started in the legislative session of 2015. So our first state, Arizona, enacted in 2016. We then had the magic number that CSPACT needed in order to be a standing compact was 7. And Georgia enacted in April of 2019. So it took us 3 years to get our 7 states. And we had our first commission meeting. And by that time, we had 11 states. So 2019 was a pretty busy year for us. And we had our first commission meeting in July of 2019. And we issued our first authorization to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology in July 6th of 2020. Next slide, please. So CSPACT is designed to regulate the day-to-day practice of telepsychology across state boundaries, as well as the temporary in-person face-to-face practice of psychology for up to 30 days. When we took CSPACT to the member jurisdictions of ASPPB and asked for feedback, one of the things they wanted us to add was this temporary component. The requirements or the allowances for temporary practice across the states varies greatly. Some jurisdictions have 5 days, some have 10, some have 30, some allow you to come in, endlessly, some want you to apply for a temporary license. So they felt like this would regulate that as well, and practicing psychologists would know what the requirements were as they were going from state to state if they wanted to go in and do something temporarily in person. Next slide, please. So why is CSPACT important? One of the main things is the increasing needs for mental health care. The American Psychological Association did a survey during COVID and asking professional psychologists what they were seeing. And what they had reported was that they were seeing an increase of 74% in anxiety, 60% in increases in depression, and around 51% in stress-related increasers. And so you can see that mental health care is very much needed, and CSPACT provides access to care. It helps coordinate the care. It provides continuity of care. And COVID has actually shown the importance of being able to have telehealth and being able to provide services in a situation where you may not have expected to needed to do. Next slide, please. So the benefits is kind of go along with why it's important. It increases access and patient access to care. It also facilitates continuity of care. And some examples of that would be when the schools were shutting down, the universities were shutting down for COVID, and they were sending their patients home. How are we going to continue to see these students as we're sending them back home, and being able to have that as they're crossing state borders? It also, because even though the e-passport didn't work as a freestanding certificate, it is part of CSPACT, and it allows the psychologists to certify that they have met acceptable standards of practice that all the states can use or look at as they're going to accept CSG. It also promotes cooperation between the CSG states in the area of legislation and regulation, and it actually provides a higher degree of consumer protection because, as we talked about, not always are the states aware of who's coming into their states doing telepsychology, and they may not have a mechanism by which they can do a disciplinary action if they need to do so. Next slide, please. So CSG became operational. Like I said, our magic number was 7. The commission was set up at that time. The commission is made up of one representative from each of the compact member states. As new states enact, they send a member to the commission. Each state has the one representative, and they are charged with doing the bylaws, the rules, and the policies that create and govern the CSG. Next slide, please. So some of the things that the commission has worked on, they have adopted the bylaws, they have promulgated rules, they have created policies and procedures, they have approved the 2021 budget. They will be meeting, their annual meeting is in November, and they will be doing next year's budget at that time. They have drafted and adopted a commission code of ethics. They elected their executive board for 2021. We will have elections again in November for some positions for 2022. And because we have a good many members now, we've actually been able to stand up our committees. We have a rules committee, we have a finance committee, we have a public relations and training committee. Next slide, please. So this is kind of what our map looks like right now. Next slide, please. We have 22 effective states, and I listed them kind of here with the dates that they became effective. And we have 26 that have actually enacted the legislation. Kansas will not become effective until January of 2022. Maine will become effective in October of 2021. And Arkansas and West Virginia had some changes to the model language, and they are under further review to see how those changes impact them being part of the participating members of CSG. Next slide, please. So we had a very, very busy legislative session this year. We had 22 bills introduced, 11 of those were enacted. We have 1 still sitting on the governor's desk, and we had 9 that either failed or were moved or carried over to 2022. Next slide, please. So how it works is that the states enact the legislation, the commission was formed, and psychologists that want to practice under the authority of CSG apply for either the authority to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology or the APIT from the commission, and as part of that, they have to have the e-passport, and once they have that authority issued, they are able to practice telepsychology into a receiving state. If they want to do temporary authorization to practice, or the temporary component, they need the TAP, which is issued by the commission, and it requires an interjurisdictional practice certificate, and that will allow them to conduct the temporary in-person face-to-face practice into a distant state. Next slide, please. So the commission requires for the telepsychology is that you do have an acceptable degree in psychology, and that is defined in the language. You have to have an unrestricted license in a compact state. You cannot have had any history of an adverse action. You must have the current e-passport and then meet any other criteria established by the commission. Currently, the 4 are the main things that you have to have in order to be issued the telepsychology authorization. Next slide, please. It is important to note that the e-passport is an ASPPB certificate, and that the commission has an agreement with ASPPB to provide services regarding vetting the e-passport, and the next slide will show the e-passport requirements. So it's very similar. It does require that you come from a doctoral degree that is either an American Psychological Association or a Canadian Psychological Association accredited program, or a joint designated program. You must have the current unrestricted license. You have to have a passing score on the exam for professional practice in psychology, no history of adverse action, and you must attest that what your intentions to practice are, and allow us to be able to primary source all of your verification information. And you also have to be held to the guidelines for the practice of telepsychology. And the guidelines were created by the American Psychological Association, ASPPB, along with the Trust, which is one of the major liability carriers for psychologists. Next slide, please. So if you're wanting to do the temporary practice, the commission requires all of these, very similar, pretty much the same thing as the telepsychology. The only difference is that you do have to have the interjurisdictional practice certificate, or the IPC. Next slide, please. Same thing. The IPC is a ASPPB certificate. The commission has that agreement that helps them, that ASPPB will be vetting for IPCs. And the IPC requirements are on the next slide. The same thing. The only difference between an IPC and an e-passport is that you do not have to verify or show your EPPP score, or your exam for professional practice in psychology. But the other ones are the same. You do have to be sitting, have a home state that's a compact state. You have to have the degree and no history of adverse actions. Next slide, please. So the fees for participating is the commission collects a $40 fee for the authority to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology and the temporary authorization to practice, or the TAP. Neither one of those have a renewal fee, and ASPPB collects a $400 application fee with a $100 annual renewal fee for the e-passport, and a $200 application fee for the IPC with a $50 renewal fee. It's important to note also that the e-passport does have a continuing education requirement upon renewal. The psychologists have to have 3 hours of continuing education in some type of continuing education service. Next slide, please. So the www.psypac.org site is where you can find most of the information that I've gone through here. It provides information about the commission. It shows when their public meetings are. It lists out who the commissioners are. It also provides a way to see the latest news, keep up with the map is available on there that I showed earlier. So it's probably our hub. Next slide, please. And one of the other things that is located on the CSG website is the Legislative Resource Kit. And that's under the Legislative Resource page. And it provides kind of a kit that includes fact sheets, organizations that have endorsed CSG. It contains the model language. It also contains a sheet that breaks down the model language into a 2-page flyer. It has articles and other related resources. Next slide, please. And that is all I have. So I am going to turn it back over to Andrew. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Janet, for that excellent introduction to CSG. And as a reminder, Janet will be staying along with us for Q&A at the end of the session. So if you have any questions for Janet, please note them in your head or drop them in the chat, and we'll have an opportunity to address those later. Next, we will have the privilege of hearing from Dan Manns. Dan is the educator for the Interstate Commission for EMS Personnel Practice. He was the moderator for the team that drafted the model EMS Compact legislation. He previously worked in the Office of Public Health Preparedness and EMS for the Vermont Department of Health. He was Vermont's EMS director for 25 years and has been in the emergency management field for over 40 years, working as an EMT, volunteer squad leader, hospital communications technician, EMS regional coordinator, EMS trainer, and state EMS director. Much of his work has been in rural areas, including Maine, Vermont, and Saudi Arabia. He served as a board member for the National Registry of EMTs for 7 years. Dan has been active in the National Association of State EMS Officials, serving as their president for 2 years and representing the association in several national projects, including the HCFA negotiated rulemaking process, creation of the EMS agenda for the future, and development of the National EMS Scope of Practice model. After retirement from state government in Vermont, he worked for 5 years as executive director for Essex Rescue in Essex Junction, Vermont. Dan, we're really glad to have you here with us today, and I will let you take it from here.
Super. Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to join with everybody today. I'll try to avoid saying, gee, everything Janet said, you know, there's great similarities among these compacts, but there's also, I think, some notable differences. So on to the next slide. So replica is the acronym for the legislation, the standard legislation that we use for states to enact this compact. End of the day, what it does is it allows EMS personnel to do their job when they cross state borders. Simultaneously, it protects the public through proper screening of personnel crossing state lines. We know a fair amount then about their education, any crime or disciplinary history, and it assures that the EMS personnel crossing state borders meet a uniform national fitness to practice. People cross state borders, EMS personnel cross state borders in a variety of circumstances. We might have, for instance, an ambulance service along an adjacent state border where they answer a call across a state line. The EMT or paramedic could be working for an air medical service where they may be based in one state. They might fly to an incident in another state, and they might transport the patient to a receiving facility in yet a third state. That's a fairly common scenario. I saw on the attendee list Senator Peacock from Louisiana. Folks down in Louisiana are, you know, having some pretty serious aftermath in the storm. Occasionally, states end up with large events like a hurricane or some other mass gathering or something, and may need personnel to assist from adjacent states. The EMS Compact affords that opportunity. Wildland fires like are going on out west require a fair amount of emergency medical services support, and those people working on those operations come from states all over the country. So there's a variety of circumstances where people routinely cross state borders. And so that's the purpose of this compact, is to facilitate that. Next slide. So one of the challenges that we have faced in emergency medical services, and I suspect that legislators, regulators, all kinds of folks considering this, the instrument that is a compact are not generally well understood by the public. And so the EMS compact, I think, bears some strong resemblances to the driver's license compact. Dan gets a driver's license in Vermont. I can go drive in other states in the country. I don't have to stop at the border. I don't have to get a license in that other state. If I get stopped for speeding or some other violation in another state, I'm expected to pay the fine or resolve the, resolve whatever the ticket I got was. And if I fail to do that, eventually Vermont's going to come after me and either get me to pay up or take my license away. And the EMS Compact works very similarly to that. There's no fees involved. There's no forms to fill out. People have great freedom of movement in going from one compact state to another, provided they have met the initial entry requirement, have an unconditional license. Next slide.
One of those calls that came through on my phone that I can't take. It says silence call. Okay.
I wanted to mute there, but I think they muted.
So,
Mike Stevens, I think your mic is open. We were getting some background noise there.
Okay, let me do something.
Okay. Here's the list of our current compact member states. Similarly to CSG, we needed to stand 10 states up to pass legislation and form our commission. We accomplished that back in 2017. We keep chipping away, get a few more states every year or two. We've got several states that are considering legislation right now. It's kind of interesting as you look at the map, you can also see how the states sort of tend to cluster. It really makes a great deal of sense for states that have adjacent states that are in the compact to get in, because that's often where the personnel are actually crossing borders. So for instance, Ohio is looking at legislation right now. Michigan is looking at legislation right now. Kentucky, I think, is very early in the stage. So, you know, you can sort of see the logic of how some states decide to get in. Okay, on to the next slide. So for a state to be eligible to enter the Emergency Medical Services Compact, they have to utilize the National Registry of EMT certification exam at the EMT, advanced EMT, and paramedic levels for initial licensure of their personnel. The National Registry certification assures that people met certain standardized educational requirements and have demonstrated competency for practice. States entering the compact have to begin using an FBI compliant biometric fingerprint background check within 5 years of the compact activation. That was back in 2017. So we're coming up on the deadline for all states to be in using fingerprint background checks. Most states already do that today. We've got a couple of states that are enacting the process to gather fingerprints on their personnel entering the system. The state has to have a process to receive, investigate, and resolve complaints, and then to share that information in a compact database. And then finally, they have to enact the compact legislation. Next slide. So an individual, Dan Mann's EMT or paramedic, I have to be licensed in a compact member state. I have to practice in good standing. I can't have any conditions or restrictions on the license in the home state. When I work, I have to work under the supervision of a physician medical director. That could be in my home state, or it could be in the remote state where I go to work. I typically default to my home state protocols. If I am beginning on an ambulance in Vermont and I'm going some other place, then I would use my Vermont clinical treatment protocols. If I were attending a major event in some other state and was working for an ambulance service in that other state, I would probably use the other state's protocols. And I have to be at least 18 years of age. Those are the individual eligibility and practice requirements. Next slide. So our compact is governed by the Interstate Commission for EMS Personnel Practice. That's who I work for and represent. They have the oversight of compact operations. They're the governmental body for our compact. Each state has one seat, one vote, and that group has rulemaking authority as defined in our legislation for compact-related matters only. One of the legislative questions that comes up occasionally is, gee, if my state gets into this compact, am I giving away all of this rulemaking authority about how EMS works in our state to this foreign group, this compact commission? The answer is not really. The Compact Commission only has authority over compact-related matters. Next slide. So we share information about personnel through this thing we call the NEMSCID, the National EMS Coordinated Database. Authority to establish that is created in the legislation. State EMS offices get to see the complete multi-state licensure history of individuals in all the other compact member states. States enter real-time significant investigatory information, share license discipline history in this, and receive cross-border notifications of out-of-state adverse actions. So if I'm a compact member state, I'm the licensing authority in a compact member state, I can see all of the other people from the other states who could be coming into my state. If someone from my state goes to another compact member state and that other state investigates them for a complaint, removes their privilege to practice in that state, I get to see it, and I have agreed in advance to investigate that in my state as if the complaint had happened in my home state. So this coordinated database is really a huge deal from my perspective in terms of the public protection. Without this, and for states that are not in the compact, there is a great vulnerability for people who are under investigation in another state, haven't yet had their license taken away. Those folks frequently like to jump state borders, go get a license in another state before the first state could take action on my license. And this is a huge step in terms of states sharing information about that in a way that protects the public. Next slide. People ask, what's the relationship to the Emergency Management Assistance Compact? You know, all states are members of EMAC, and EMAC gets activated for major incidents, and it relieves a lot of licensing requirements. The EMS Compact is subordinate to EMAC. And so if EMAC is activated, if there's a major event, the EMAC Compact takes precedence over the Emergency Medical Services Compact. Next slide. So where are we today? Our commission has been formed. It's meeting. We have officers in place. We've created bylaws. Rules of operation were created. And we went live. We were in the process of developing this NEMSCID database. We went live with cross-border practice in March of 2021. That was clearly a decision of our executive committee based on the demands we were having nationwide for cross-border operations relative to COVID. And I think at the time we created the EMS Compact, the pandemic scenario was but one of many that wasn't really at the forefront of anyone's imagination. It's become huge, and states are sending personnel back and forth. We have EMS personnel participating in vaccine clinics in adjacent states, helping out in that. It's been very helpful for pandemic related operations. So we fired the thing up in March of 2021. We weren't quite done with the NEMSCID database, and so states started exchanging information on people crossing state borders using a paper form. We have now made enough progress on the computerized automated database that we've given up the paper form. But people are crossing borders routinely today using the compact. Next slide. So we're continuing to work on finalizing implementation of NEMSCID. States are in the process of submitting their data, testing the ability to both submit new data and receive it from the other states. We're refining policies for data sharing. We have to be cautious about not sharing specific crime information. Is not allowed under the provisions of the FBI fingerprint background checks. So we cannot share information that a state might learn about specific crimes in someone's background. We're encouraging more states to join the EMS Compact. Our goal is let's get all 50 states and territories into this thing. Our commission is hiring an executive director for Compact Commission support and operations. I will be retiring for about the 14th time at the end of this year. And hopefully in the next day or two, we're going to have an announcement out about who our new executive director is. We need to update and improve our website and maintain a national presence to assist in personnel crossing state borders. So those are things we're working on today. Next slide. And this whole compact operation, and I think this probably parallels virtually every other compact. There's a lot of stakeholders in this thing. The National Registry is our certifying agency. We've got the law, the Interstate Commission, states who regulate practice, the EMS personnel, the National Association of State EMS Officials, a variety of other EMS professional groups, and we have various federal partners, all of whom have an interest in this thing, all of whom are working to get this fully implemented. But it takes a village. There's there's a lot of people, a lot of interests, a lot of outlooks that need to be reconciled to really make this thing work successfully. Next slide. And our key partner with the Interstate Commission is the National Registry of EMTs. One of the questions that comes up all the time when states are considering legislation is like, what does this thing cost? And right now, the expenses of our compact are being covered by the National Registry of EMTs, the certifying agency. They have a great interest in supporting cross-border practice and have been very willing to put their money where their mouth is to get this thing supported. So as of now, no state has paid $1 into the compact, and the registry is intending to cover on into the future the major infrastructure and personnel costs associated with the EMS Compact. So great thanks to the registry. They've been a great partner for us on the commission. And maybe there's one more slide. And there's my contact information. Our website is just www.emscompact.gov. There's my email, phone number. If there's anything I can help folks out with, I'm happy to do it at any time. And I think that wraps us up and takes us to questions. So back to you, Andrew.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dan, for that fantastic presentation. I think we're all a little bit smarter for it. So now we have quite a bit of time remaining, about 20 minutes or so for question and answer. I've received a couple questions in the chat. Feel free to keep those coming if you have any more. But I would go ahead and, we got a hand raised from Gerald Ortiz. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I was willing to wait my turn. The other questions had been posted earlier, but let me go ahead and ask it, and then I may have others later on. When we tried the site compact, each of the last 2 times we've tried it in New Mexico, we've run into opposition from attorneys on the Judiciary Committee who object to the notion that any court action taken against the compact has to be filed in the compact's home state. And I just wonder if that's come up in other states and what the best response would be. I tried to make clear, and the attorney for the Compact National Board tried to make clear that we're only talking about actions involving the compact itself, not actions against an individual professional practitioner. But they still were just of a mind that somehow was an unusual requirement and would limit protections for people in New Mexico. So what would be the best response to that?
I'll take a quick crack at that. And Gerald, I will only note from having stubbed our toes with the EMS Compact in your state as well, you've got a very tough committee there that looks at compact legislation, and I think I don't know kind of the history or the temperament of that group, but they raise a lot of those kinds of issues about every compact that I think gets considered in your state. I think my best advice is to quit listening to guys like me. I think the group that really is sort of above reproach, is absolutely neutral, is there to serve legislators, governors, is the Council of State Governments. And I think, you see, a guy like me, I'm a suspect because I've got a vested interest in trying to get the EMS Compact through your state legislature. The Council of State Governments, their interest is trying to make state governments work smoothly. And so I think they've got the legal resources, the independence, and I think probably the best background to help with that. That would be my quick response. Maybe Janet has another take.
We are very familiar with New Mexico, and we spent many evenings waiting to testify this last session. So it's very nice to see you again. We had it come up in a couple of jurisdictions this past legislative session, Minnesota being one. And one of the things that was done in Minnesota was that they did make the change, but they also allowed, if the commission found this change to be unacceptable, that the change would then become not added, and Minnesota could be added to the commission. The commission did look at it, felt like it was going to put an undue burden on the commission that the other states did not. And so they voted down that option, but Minnesota, because of the way they wrote the law, was able to join CSG this year, even with that modification. I think that is a way of some of the states trying to make concessions to address both sides and allow the state also to have the opportunity to go before any of the compact commissions to decide whether or not this change is going to impact the other states that sit at the table. We can't, neither Dan nor I can speak for the commission and how they judge things coming forward, and this allows the opportunity for the state to make the changes that they feel they need to make, but it also allows the commission to evaluate them as to whether or not they're acceptable to come and sit because of how it impacts the other members sitting at the table.
Both of those are excellent ideas. Thank you. I think we actually adopted, when we passed, the only compact I'm aware of us having passed in the last couple of years is the nursing compact. And I think we adopted language like that, that if in the event the little changes that had been made were found unacceptable by the compact, that we would drop them. But we might try that again with this and see if we can get any further. I really like the idea too of using the Council of State Governments as an authority to try to, an objective, dispassionate authority that doesn't have a dog in the fight, that just wants the best form of practice to go forward. So thank you. Thanks very much.
And thank you, Senator Ortiz. Yeah, CSG is obviously happy to help in any way that we can. And our staff attorneys, have worked on several different interstate compacts, and we are working with New Mexico, to kind of resolve these issues on a couple of other compacts. So we're definitely happy to help out. Just shoot me an email. I'll put my email address in the chat if you'd like to talk further.
Great, good.
It's
Thank you.
debates@csg.org. Yeah, thank you. Let's see. Oh, so this sort of came up in the answers to the first question, but I wanted to highlight once again the issue of amendments to these licensure compacts. So as you may know, I mean, these compacts are essentially contracts. They're governed by the Compacts Clause of the Constitution as well as the Contracts Clause of the Constitution. And so that requires that all states and all members enact substantially the same language. So there are times when certain changes are necessary to conform to a constitutional provision in a state. There are cases in which certain variances are necessary, but I wanted to get Dan and Janet's opinions or inputs on just generally speaking what can happen if a state enacts a version of a compact that does not conform to the legislation enacted by the other member states.
Again, I'll take a crack at that. We try to monitor legislation as it's in progress in the states. And if a state appears headed towards making a substantive change to the language in the contract, we try to point out to them this may not be acceptable, and the Compact Commission may decide not to admit your state because your legislation is substantially different from the model compact legislation. People make changes to the compact legislation all the time. In the model, it's paragraph 1, subparagraph A. Some other states' format is paragraph A, subparagraph 1. Formatting, things like that don't typically cause anybody much heartache. It's when they really change something that could affect the expectations on that state passing the legislation, or how that state commits to the operations of the compact. Those things tend to raise more eyebrows, and we try to head them off during the legislative process. But in the end, if a state were to pass legislation that was really deviant from the model legislation, the Compact Commission could ultimately decide not to recognize that legislation.
Thanks, Dan. Janet, anything to add there?
The commission actually has 2 rules that are out for public comment right now, and one of those deals with the processes for reviewing legislation that gets introduced and gets changed, where it will go as far as review. This time, because we didn't have that, it went to the full commission for the 5 states that made substantial changes. Going forward, the executive board will review those so that we don't have to wait as long as if the state has made some changes. But that was something that was added. We had not had really any substantial changes until this legislative session, and needed to have some way to address and for the commission to be able to review those changes. We're like Dan, we also look at them when they get introduced, but sometimes along the way things get a little changed, and we try to keep up with them through our legislative tracking system, but sometimes some things just get through, or they're not willing to not make the change. And that's where I think this new rule helps us, having some guidelines that states can see what's going to happen if the things get modified, the language gets modified.
Great, thank you both. We have another hand raised. Mr. Stevens, go for it.
Hello, I'm the chairman of the Missouri House Health and Mental Health Policy Committee, and so I've been working on issues like this for a while. I'm very supportive of measures like this for this and other practices. So I want you to know I'm very much in the loop as far as wanting to support this. I do. First of all, I want to confirm what I thought I saw on the map, that Missouri was a part of the compact. Am I reading that correctly?
Missouri's in the EMS Compact for sure.
They were one of the first 7 in the CSG Compact as well.
Okay, all right, well, that's good. The question always comes up, and I'm sure you've dealt with this, but I would like to get some clarification. Okay, a therapist is in Vermont, and the patient is in Missouri, and the therapist does something that is or is perceived to be unprofessional, egregious, illegal, so on and so forth, and a complaint is filed. Who has jurisdiction over that, and how do you, you know what, in dealing with this, I know that you have dealt with it a lot, that these parochial boundary disputes always come down to the what in one case they would, in one instance, to say are power parochial power protections, and another view it would be it's our only way of protecting the public. So my question then is, in a situation that I described, how would a complaint like that, or how would a charge like that be handled or adjudicated, or who would have jurisdiction, or how would an action that took place in one state but had its effect in another be dealt with?
So I will try to take this one. We have actually a rule, rule number 7, that deals with adverse actions. And because the psychologist is sitting in their home state where they hold that license, the home state is ultimately responsible because they have the license to which they can take the action against.
Yes, I would assume so. But how does the complaint in one state actually amount to action in another?
Okay, they have in this rule, they are allowed to do a joint investigation. The receiving state where the patient is located, that state can also take an action. They can do a cease and desist or an injunction against the psychologist, which would have them be able to lose that privilege to practice in that state. That information is then relayed to the licensing board, where the home state, and they're able to take an action against the license itself. So the two work together. It provides the mechanism for them to be able to share information and to process the complaint in both states.
Okay, so the board in Missouri could would not have could not take licensure action, but could but its death penalty would be you can no longer treat patients in Missouri.
Correct. Without, they would be lose their privilege to practice under the compact. They can all issue a cease and desist. Any type of disciplinary action, a cease and desist in Missouri, or a state action by the Vermont board in your example, would have the psychologist lose their right to practice under CSG. They cannot have had any adverse action. That doesn't mean that they can't then go apply to Missouri for a license, but the board would have that right to look at them and evaluate what this situation was. So that's what's going to happen in that process.
And conversely, in that process, I presume that the therapist would have a prescribed due process. I mean, we wouldn't want to, as happens, for the process to be weaponized.
They would have the same process, the due process in Missouri they have now, and the same due process they have now in Vermont as to how they handle their disciplinary actions.
Which I presume there are general similarities from state to state.
I believe so, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, let me take a crack at that from the EMS perspective. It's less likely that the practice, the person was in one state and the patient was in a second state, because EMS is generally delivered kind of hands-on where the person is. But the remote state could investigate a complaint, apply the due process to the person just as if they were licensed in that remote state. And instead of, at the end, the death penalty, as you say, instead of revoking their license, they would remove their privilege to practice. They can revoke that. if a person loses the privilege to practice in any compact member state, they lose it in all compact member states. And the home state that person came from now agrees to investigate this complaint as if it had happened in their home state. Again, apply the due process and determine, did this inappropriate action in the remote state, is that reason to revoke this person's license in the home state that granted it to them? So I tell EMS personnel, you get huge privilege under this compact. You can go and practice in other places. The stakes of doing something wrong are huge. You are likely to make yourself unlicensable in any state if you mess up bad enough, even in a remote state. So it's very strong public protection.
It's always a question. We run into this, these territorial protective measures with the medical societies and stuff. And so I'm for this. I just want to understand the mechanism.
No, it's a great question, and it's important to kind of follow it through logically to the conclusion to understand, how does it happen that this guy gets told, sorry, you don't get to practice here anymore? I mean, that's a very, very important part of this.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Representative, and thank you both for those responses. So we are coming up on the end of our time here. So at this point, I wanted to pose it to our panelists. If you all don't have something that you have to go to right now, if you wouldn't mind sticking around for another 5 minutes or so. We do have a couple more questions, but absolutely no pressure to do so.
Easy, happy to do it.
Not a problem.
Awesome, great. So another thing that is a bit of a, I guess, unique case for the EMS Compact that I wanted to highlight again is the idea of the rules of the road. So I guess just to put this question as simply as possible to Dan, which state's scope of practice laws and I guess protocols apply when practicing in another state?
So the compact legislation in the EMS Compact example specifies that the default is to the home state scope of practice. The logic of that from the EMS perspective is Dan starts out in the state of Vermont, just to take an example, and I go next door to respond to an emergency in another place. If you want to mess me up in terms of what I'm going to do for that patient, ask me to follow the laws of the state next door and the protocols of the state next door and the practices of the state next door, which I'm really not familiar with, you see. And so it's a setup where the person will likely make a mistake because we use this drug for this kind of a situation. The state next door uses the alternate drug and doesn't allow our. Okay, so if on the other hand, I were to take a second job, let's say, and I go to work for another ambulance service in an adjacent state that's a compact member, I may very well be able to keep working using my Vermont license. But I'm then working under physician medical direction from the remote state. I'm working for an EMS agency in that remote state. I'm not just crossing the border to answer a call. If I was in that kind of a situation, the expectation is going to be that I'm going to follow the protocols and the clinical care prescribed in that other state. I don't get to come in and determine the practice. So it's set up that our default is the expectation that the agency from the home state was the one providing service in the remote state. But if it's not, then I'm going to follow the rules of the road in the remote state. I may not have explained that very articulately. Did that make sense?
I think that made sense. And then Janet, I mean, do you want to address that same question for CSG as well, just so that we're clear here?
We've had that same issue because the psychologist is sitting in their home state under the authority of their home license, but yet we say they're practicing under the scope of practice into that receiving state where the patient is. We have, it is amazing how many rules you will continue to make as you go through this process. So we have a rule out for public comment right now to address what scope of practice means in that receiving state. It is there's a rule dealing with the telepsychology component as well as dealing with the going in face-to-face. But what it has been is that the scope of practice entails all of the rules that help protect the consumer in that state. So we think the rule is going to help explain that better, especially for the practicing psychologist, because that's been where we have received a lot of our questions is what am I supposed to be working under? So we're looking forward to getting this rule finalized in November.
Good, thank you. And I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question here that I received in the chat. And so this gets at the idea that a compact commission, you know, is because it's composed of member states who regulate a profession, kind of becomes this like forum in a way for the profession. And Dan kind of covered this with all the moving parts, you know, that contribute to you know, the final product of the EMS Compact. So I guess the question is, do you see with your commissions, you know, a kind of drive towards a more uniformity and more of a national kind of standard for licensure in your professions? Janet, feel free to go first.
Oh, gee, thanks. I think because we have the e-passport certificate and the IPC certificate, that set up licensing requirements for psychology vary across all the states. There is some wide variations from everything from regional accreditation to states that only accept APA and CPA designated or accredited programs, and then you have everything in between. You have variations on supervision guidelines and what they require for postdoc, internship, practicums. You have do they require some kind of extra, you know, difference. The closest thing we've came to consistency across psychology is the passing score for the exam. They're pretty much on the same plate for that, but everything else is all over the place. I think the compact, because of putting it to those two certificates, helped level out those requirements as about as well as we can right now. We are hoping from the data that we get from the compact and the participations that we can actually work with the licensing boards and try to get them into a center as they start looking at their requirements for all licensing. But right now we think that's about as close as we have come to putting some kind of consistent requirements across all the jurisdictions.
Yeah, and I will answer that question unambiguously, yes. That I think what the EMS Compact has driven is that member states issuing licenses are now using fingerprint background checks for all new applicants. All persons have obtained National Registry certification as documentation of their education and competency. You know, everybody's, we're only using people over 18 years old. I mean, there's certain of those requirements that are standard. There are, this is not an all or nothing situation. And again, I'll pick on Vermont specifically in this example. To hold a license to do anything in the state of Vermont, you cannot owe the state back taxes. So in addition to the things that would be required for compact eligibility, if I owed back taxes to the state of Vermont, they would deny a license to me. You see, so states may have additional things beyond what the compact is, but that core set of what's the sort of meaty stuff is what all the compact states are agreeing on. And I think the compact is driving standardization in that regard.
Very well said. And I think that that's a good place for us to leave it, since we're well over time by this point. But I do want to thank our panelists, Janet and Dan, one more time for providing such great information. And I do want to thank all of our audience that stuck it out for this hour plus. And thank everybody for attending, and hope you found it informative and engaging. And there will be another installment in about a month's time. And so of this webinar series covering the extant healthcare licensure compacts. So please stay tuned for that. And so if there are no additional questions, I don't want to take any more of anybody's time. So I will wish everyone a pleasant afternoon, and thank you so much once more for attending. Have a great day, everybody.